What happens when Hollywood's most respected legend meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live turned into an absolute powder keg that has the entire entertainment industry buzzing and social media exploding with reactions. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans collide on live television. The tension was palpable from the moment Clint Eastwood walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage. The 94-year-old acting legend, promoting his latest directorial effort, carried himself with that familiar stoic presence that has defined his 6-decade career. But something was different about his demeanor. There was an edge, a barely contained frustration that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. Kimmel, sporting his usual smug grin and relaxed posture, appeared completely oblivious to the storm that was about to engulf his studio. The interview began innocuously enough, with Kimmel launching into his typical routine of light banter and surface-level questions about Eastwood's new film. "So Clint, at your age, what keeps you motivated to keep making movies?" Kimmel asked with that characteristic tone that somehow managed to sound both condescending and dismissive simultaneously. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he measured his response. "Well, Jimmy, when you've been doing something as long as I have, you learn to focus on what matters, telling stories that have substance, not just chasing cheap laughs and easy applause." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a fired pistol. Kimmel's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he recovered, but perceptive viewers could see the flash of irritation cross his face. "That's interesting coming from someone who made a career out of shooting people in westerns," Kimmel shot back, attempting to deflect with humor but landing with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The studio audience offered a scattered, uncertain laugh, sensing the growing tension but not yet understanding its source. Eastwood leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands clasped together with deliberate calm. "At least when I shot people in movies, it served a purpose in the story. It wasn't just mindless entertainment designed to mock and belittle others for ratings." The words were delivered with Eastwood's trademark measured cadence, but there was steel beneath the silk. Kimmel's eyes darted toward his producers offstage, clearly realizing this wasn't going according to his prepared script. "Come on, Clint. Lighten up. It's just comedy," Kimmel said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge while trying to maintain his jovial host persona. "We're all just trying to entertain people here. Sometimes that means poking fun at politicians, celebrities, whoever's in the news. It's what people expect from late-night television." But Eastwood wasn't buying the deflection, and his response would set the stage for what was about to become one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. "Is that what you call it?" Eastwood asked, his voice dropping to that familiar, gravelly whisper that had commanded attention in countless films. "Because from where I sit, it looks more like you've built a career on tearing people down, making cheap shots at anyone who doesn't share your particular worldview. You hide behind the comedy label, but there's nothing funny about using your platform to spread division and hatred." The words cut through the studio like a blade, and suddenly the atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable to downright hostile. Kimmel's mask was slipping now, his practiced smile becoming strained as he struggled to maintain control of his own show. "Look, I think you're taking this a little too seriously. Comedy has always been about pushing boundaries, challenging people, making them think while they laugh. If you can't handle a little ribbing, maybe late-night television isn't for you." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now, and it was exactly the wrong tone to take with a man who had earned respect through decades of unwavering principles and authentic artistry. The camera captured every micro-expression as Eastwood's face hardened into that iconic stare that had made countless movie villains quake in their boots. "Son," he said, the single word carrying more weight than most people's entire vocabulary. "I've been handling pressure and criticism since before you were born. The difference is, I've always stood behind my work with integrity. Can you say the same?" The challenge hung in the air like a gunfighter's dare, and everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. A moment where Hollywood's old guard was drawing a line in the sand against everything they saw as wrong with modern entertainment culture. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would transform a simple talk show appearance into a cultural flashpoint that would dominate headlines and social media for days to come, as these two vastly different approaches to entertainment were about to collide in spectacular fashion. Kimmel, clearly rattled by Eastwood's unflinching directness, made the fatal mistake of doubling down on his position. "You know what, Clint? I think you're living in the past. This is modern television, and audiences want hosts who aren't afraid to call out hypocrisy wherever they see it. We can't all make movies where problems are solved with a gun and a one-liner." The jab was meant to wound, but it only served to awaken something primal in the legendary actor-director. The studio audience fell into an uncomfortable silence, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond the usual talk show banter. Eastwood's response came with the precision of a master craftsman who had spent decades perfecting his art. "Hypocrisy," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like thunder before a storm. "Let me tell you about hypocrisy, Jimmy. Hypocrisy is preaching tolerance while savagely attacking anyone who disagrees with you. Hypocrisy is claiming to champion the little guy while building your fortune on mocking people who can't fight back. Hypocrisy is hiding behind a desk and a laugh track while real people suffer the consequences of the hatred you help spread." The words hit Kimmel like physical blows, and for the first time in years, the usually quick-witted host found himself speechless. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no clever comeback emerged. The cameras captured it all. The moment when Hollywood's self-appointed moral authority was stripped bare by genuine moral clarity. Behind the cameras, producers were frantically signaling, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this unprecedented confrontation continue to unfold. "You want to talk about the past?" Eastwood continued, his voice gaining momentum like a gathering storm. "The past taught us about respect, about earning your place through hard work and authentic achievement. The past understood that entertainment should elevate people, not tear them down. You've turned this platform into a weapon, and you wield it with the reckless abandon of someone who's never faced real consequences for their actions." Kimmel's face was flushing red now, his carefully constructed public persona crumbling under the weight of Eastwood's relentless honesty. "Are you seriously going to sit there and lecture me about consequences? You're the one who talked to an empty chair at a political convention, for crying out loud." The desperate attempt at deflection was met with a look that could have melted steel, and Kimmel immediately realized he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. "That empty chair," Eastwood said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire studio, "represented something you clearly don't understand. The courage to stand up for your beliefs even when the whole world is watching and waiting for you to fail. At least I had the guts to put myself out there, to take a real risk. All you do is sit behind this desk, taking potshots at people who actually have the courage to lead, to create, to build something meaningful." The tension in the studio was now so thick it was almost suffocating. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some pulling out their phones to capture what they instinctively knew was television history in the making. Kimmel's band members sat frozen, unsure whether to play him out or stay silent. Even the usually animated sidekick, Guillermo, had retreated to the shadows, sensing that this was no longer the jovial workplace he knew. "You know what your problem is, Clint?" Kimmel said, his voice now carrying a bitter edge that revealed the man behind the manufactured persona. "You can't accept that the world has moved on from your outdated values. People don't want your John Wayne fantasy anymore. They want honesty. They want someone who isn't afraid to speak truth to power, even if it makes some people uncomfortable. But his words rang hollow in the face of Eastwood's unwavering presence, like a child's tantrum in the presence of a mountain. Eastwood stood up slowly, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the entire interview area. "Truth to power?" he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of authentic experience. "Son, you wouldn't recognize real power if it slapped you across that smug face of yours. Real power doesn't come from hiding behind a team of writers and a laugh track. Real power comes from standing alone when it matters, from creating something that lasts beyond the next news cycle, from earning respect instead of demanding it." The studio fell into complete silence as these words settled over the room like a funeral shroud. Kimmel looked smaller somehow, diminished by the presence of genuine gravitas sitting just feet away from him. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached for his coffee mug, a nervous gesture that the cameras caught in perfect detail. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone in the building could feel it. What started as a routine celebrity interview had transformed into a masterclass in authentic presence versus manufactured personality, and the contrast was devastating for the host who had built his career on borrowed confidence and scripted wit. But Eastwood wasn't finished. What he said next would turn this already explosive confrontation into something that would redefine how America viewed its entertainment industry. "You want to know what really bothers me about people like you, Jimmy?" Eastwood said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "You've taken something sacred, the art of storytelling, the responsibility of having a platform, and you've perverted it into something ugly and divisive. You don't create, you destroy. You don't build bridges, you burn them. And then, you have the audacity to act like you're some kind of moral authority." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Kimmel's face went pale as he realized this wasn't just criticism. It was a complete dismantling of everything he represented. Kimmel's desperation was now visible to everyone in the studio. His hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white with tension. "You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "I've built a career on connecting with people, on making them laugh during difficult times. I've given a voice to the voiceless. I've stood up to bullies and tyrants. What have you done lately besides make movies that glorify violence and toxic masculinity?" The accusation was Kimmel's last desperate gambit, but it backfired spectacularly. Eastwood's eyes flashed with something approaching contempt, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned every word through lived experience. "Toxic masculinity?" he repeated, the phrase dripping with disdain. "Is that what you call taking responsibility for your actions? Is that what you call protecting the people you care about? Is that what you call standing up for what's right even when it's hard?" He leaned forward slightly, his presence somehow filling the entire studio. "You wouldn't know real masculinity if it bit you on that soft behind of yours." The audience gasped audibly at the unexpected vulgarity from the usually composed legend. Kimmel's jaw dropped, and for a moment he looked like a fish out of water, gulping for air. His producers were now frantically gesturing from the wings, but the confrontation had taken on a life of its own, beyond anyone's control. Social media was already exploding with clips of the exchange, and the hashtag #Eastwood'sKimmel was trending within minutes. "You sit there night after night," Eastwood continued, his voice gaining power with each word, "poisoning the minds of young people, teaching them that cynicism is wisdom, that tearing others down is somehow noble. You've created a generation that thinks mockery is discourse and hatred is humor. And for what? For ratings? For money? For the approval of people who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the real world?" Kimmel was visibly sweating now, his carefully styled hair beginning to show the strain of the moment. That's not what I do," he protested weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm a comedian. I make people laugh. If you can't handle some jokes, Maybe you should stick to your westerns where everyone shoots first and asks questions later." The attempted comeback only made things worse. Eastwood's expression hardened into something that had intimidated countless movie villains and real-life adversaries. "At least in my westerns the good guys win," he said, his voice dropping to that familiar growl that had defined his screen persona for decades. "At least there's a moral center, a sense of right and wrong. What moral center do you offer? What hope do you give people besides teaching them to hate their neighbors?" The studio had become a pressure cooker of tension, and everyone present could feel that something was about to explode. Kimmel's usual support system, his band, his sidekick, even his loyal audience, seemed to have abandoned him in the face of Eastwood's relentless assault on his character and career. The host was now completely isolated, exposed as the hollow showman he had always been beneath the carefully constructed public image. "You know what the real tragedy is?" Eastwood said, standing up to his full height and towering over the seated host. "You had a platform that could have been used for good. You could have brought people together. You could have celebrated the best in human nature instead of wallowing in the worst. But you chose the easy path, the path of division, of hatred, of cheap shots and cheaper laughs. You chose to be part of the problem instead of part of the solution." Kimmel's voice, when he finally found it, was barely above a whisper. I don't have to listen to this. This is my show." But even as he said the words, everyone in the studio could hear how powerless they sounded. The dynamic had shifted, so completely that Kimmel no longer seemed like the host of his own program. He was merely another guest being systematically dismantled by a master of his craft. "Your show," Eastwood repeated, his voice laden with irony. "This isn't your show anymore, Jimmy. This is a reckoning." This is what happens when someone who's actually lived a life, who's actually stood for something, meets someone who spent their entire career hiding behind other people's words and other people's courage. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the stunned studio. "And you know what the saddest part is? Deep down, you know I'm right." The silence that followed was deafening. Kimmel's face had gone through a spectrum of emotions: anger, fear, embarrassment, and finally, something approaching recognition. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely, and viewers could see the insecure man behind the confident host facade. But that moment of vulnerability would be short-lived, because what happened next would push this confrontation beyond the point of no return. In a desperate attempt to regain control of his crumbling show, Kimmel made the catastrophic decision to go nuclear. "You know what, Clint?" he said, his voice rising with false bravado. "Maybe it's time someone told you that your time is over. You're a relic from a bygone era, preaching values that died with black and white television. Nobody cares what some 90-year-old has-been thinks about modern entertainment. Why don't you just go back to your ranch and fade away like the irrelevant dinosaur you've become?" The words hit the studio like a physical force, and the collective gasp from the audience was audible, even through the television cameras. Kimmel had just committed the unforgivable sin of disrespecting not just Clint Eastwood personally, but everything he represented. Decades of authentic artistry, unwavering principle, and genuine cultural contribution. The host's face immediately showed he knew he had gone too far, but it was already too late to take back the words that would end his career as America knew it. Eastwood's reaction was swift and devastating in its simplicity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture wildly. He didn't resort to the theatrical histrionics that Kimmel specialized in. Instead, he simply looked at the host with a mixture of pity and disgust that was more damning than any angry outburst could have been. "You just proved everything I said about you," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the studio with crystal clarity. "When faced with truth, you resort to personal attacks. When challenged to defend your actions, you attack the messenger instead of addressing the message." The legendary actor began removing his microphone with deliberate precision, each movement calculated and purposeful. "I've worked with some of the greatest talents in Hollywood history," he continued, his voice never wavering from that measured tone that had commanded respect for over 6 decades. "I've directed Academy Award winners. I've created films that will outlast all of us. But I have never, in all my years in this business, encountered someone so small, so petty, and so fundamentally dishonest as you, Jimmy Kimmel." Kimmel was now visibly panicking, realizing that he was watching his reputation disintegrate in real time. "Wait, Clint, I didn't mean—" he started. But Eastwood cut him off with a look that could have stopped a charging bull. The host's attempt at damage control only made him look more pathetic, more desperate, and more exposed than ever before. "You meant every word," Eastwood said, standing up and adjusting his jacket with the same casual dignity he had brought to countless movie roles. "And that's the most honest thing you've said all evening. At least now your audience knows exactly who you are. A bitter, small-minded individual who built his career on the misery of others and can't handle being confronted with his own failures." The studio was in complete chaos now. Producers were shouting conflicting instructions, camera operators didn't know where to focus, and the audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing the complete meltdown of one of late-night television's biggest stars. Social media was exploding with real-time reactions, and Kimmel Destroyed was trending worldwide within minutes of the exchange. But Eastwood wasn't finished delivering his final verdict. "You asked me what I've done lately," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "I've spent my life creating things that matter, telling stories that inspire people to be better than they are. I've built a legacy based on respect, hard work, and genuine achievement." "What's your legacy, Jimmy? What will people remember about you when you're gone? That you were really good at reading other people's jokes off a teleprompter?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had been completely and utterly destroyed by a master, dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but the hollow shell of manufactured celebrity. The contrast between authentic greatness and artificial fame had never been more starkly illustrated than in this moment. "I came here tonight to promote a film about redemption," Eastwood said, walking toward the edge of the stage. "About second chances and the possibility that people can change for the better. But some people, I'm beginning to realize, are exactly who they appear to be." He paused at the steps leading off the stage, turning back one final time to deliver his parting words. "Good luck explaining this to your corporate masters, Jimmy. Something tells me they're not going to be very happy with their investment." With that, Clint Eastwood walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, leaving behind a host whose career would never recover from the most devastating takedown in television history. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours, clips of the confrontation had been viewed millions of times across all social media platforms. Major advertisers began pulling their support from the show, and ABC executives found themselves in emergency meetings discussing damage control. Kimmel's ratings plummeted to record lows, and industry insiders began speculating about his future in television. But perhaps most damaging of all was the way the confrontation had exposed the fundamental emptiness at the heart of modern celebrity culture. In just 20 minutes, Clint Eastwood had reminded America what authentic greatness looked like, and by comparison, everything else seemed hollow and manufactured. The king of late-night television had been dethroned by a true legend, and everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen something that would be talked about for generations to come.